Is on catechisms and faith formation in the Catholic Church, and it's a topic that I'm fascinated with. And a lot of people think catechisms have gone out of fashion, or they might have a rigid notion of what we mean by catechisms. So I started off with a picture on the catechism class from around 1900, and I think this might be people's image of a catechism. It's normally associated with a book focused on questions and answers and memorization directed at children. But the catechism has had an ancient and fabulously varied history in the Christian and in the Catholic tradition. So if we start at the beginning with the word catechism, it comes from the Greek catechismos, which means to teach from word of mouth. So it's oral tradition. And there's a wonderful ancient tradition of oral faith formation, oral storytelling, oral communication of faith in the Christian tradition. And I want to go right back to early Christian examples of catechisms and to some of the church fathers and catechisms. And then we'll hop up to the post-Reformation catechisms and Reformation catechisms right up to the modern day. So we're going on a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of catechisms throughout the ages. And the first thing I want to say is that catechisms come in all shapes and sizes. And indeed, the gospel texts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the writings of Paul, these are catechetical tools. Paul's letters were written to support faith formation, to clarify issues of church teaching and doctrine, to scaffold people as they searched to understand the faith that they were entering into. And the Gospel of Luke is told, we see in the first chapter of Luke, verse 3, it was written to Theophilus so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been catechized, about which you have been formed in faith. So catechisms come as documents or sources of helping us to understand our faith and to communicate truth. So I love the fact that the Gospels are love stories, they're narratives of faith, originally communicated orally to support people in their own developing faith. And a particular favourite of mine from the days when I was studying theology was the Didache or the Didache, a fabulous, short, simple Greek text from the end of the 1st century and to the beginning of the 2nd century. And just as an aside, if you're interested in ancient Christian texts, go to the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. They have fragments from the Gospels there that are so old, some of the oldest in the world, and they're just wonderful to see. Anyway, back to this wonderful text, the Didache, or the teaching of the 12 apostles, and it was used to teach, and it was written in Greek. We don't know whether it was from Syria or if it came from Egypt, but its provenance is ancient. And it was used to instruct catechumens, that is, people who were entering into the Christian faith. And remember, in the early church, there wasn't infant baptism. There were people who, as adults, were turning to the Christian faith, and they wanted to know about this faith. So the Didache is a document that's easy to understand because it's written with communication of faith in mind. It's short and it has a narrative. It has the main teaching saying to readers or hearers, because it was communicated orally first, there's a way of life and there's a way of death. And which way are you going to choose? And so the way of life is outlined, and that's the way of Christian life. So there's one of the earliest accounts of the Eucharist and the gathering of Christians and the breaking of bread and the celebration of the resurrection of Jesus and his presence during the Eucharist, an account of baptisms, anointing with oil, and then lots of teachings on morality and life and spirituality, prayers. And there's a focus on the end of times. So it's a very short document, and if you Google it, you'll get it online, Didache, and it wouldn't take you 10 minutes to read it. Spends so much longer on the way of life than it does on the way of death. The way of death is teachings and livings that are contrary to the Christian tradition and to life in God and life in love. If we go up then, moving up to the 4th and 5th century, and we learn from St. Augustine, the most wonderful teacher and theologian of the church. He was a bishop in North Africa, and he wrote a gorgeous long letter to a catechist, somebody who was teaching faith, called De Catechismus Rudibus. And he wrote it to Deo Gratias, a deacon who was really exhausted by the task of having to teach people who are unlearned in the Christian faith. So these poor people wanted to know something about the Christian faith, but they were not scholarly, they were not literate. And Deo Gratias tells us that sometimes when he's teaching them, not only are the unlearned he's teaching bored, but he is exhausted and bored himself. And he says his own teaching is a bit lackluster. And he writes to Augustine, the great master teacher. Can you pause the recording, Carla, just for a second? And he says to Deo Gratias, look when your teaching should never be tedious or boring. And you should focus on a story. You should tell a story. And he says, when it comes to the Christian tradition and when it comes to catechisms, compendiums of teaching, you start off with creation, you work through the prophets, you build up to the coming of Jesus, the life of Jesus, the death and resurrection of Jesus, and then you focus on the final things to come so that it makes sense. And he says, whatever you're teaching, love has to be at the heart of it. The God of love, and love is to be the focus of your teaching. And you should be loving with your students. You should rejoice in what you're teaching, and you should be enthusiastic. And he says students will mirror you. And it's wonderful to have this in the 4th century, methodologies of teaching that are really very common today. We know that we have to focus on students and not bore them and have student-centered teaching and learning. St. Augustine wrote a catechism called the Enchiridion. Enchiridion just means the handbook, and he focused that again on faith, hope and charity. And there's an emphasis on narrative and having a format that is understandable. And Augustine's catechism influences subsequent catechisms, even down to the Catechism of the Catholic Church in 1992, and revised versions of that. And he focuses on faith, hope and love. And within that are the Creed and the Lord's Prayer and the sacraments. So Augustine was a consummate teacher, and it was all about clarity and enabling the learner to understand. So I'm going from the early church and the church fathers right up to the Reformation. And as we know, in 1517, Martin Luther wrote his 95 Theses, and the ensuing, he was excommunicated from the Catholic Church, and the Lutheran Church began, and a whole host of Reformed traditions began. And Luther used the printing press, the Gutenberg press, to great effect, and it spread the teachings of the Reformation. And Luther used it in 1529 to produce his small catechism. And here we have some pages from the small catechism. And in this catechism, you will find the teachings of Lutheranism, the 10 Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, the sacraments of baptism, confession, and Eucharist. And so this catechism became replicated, it was published, it was handed around, and there was some considerable success in teaching the doctrines of the Lutheran tradition, and other Reformed traditions began to use catechisms. So the Catholic Church, as part of the Counter-Reformation, decided to produce a catechism of the Council of Trent. And this Archbishop here, Carlo Borromeo, on the left, he was the one who introduced it as a question and answer format. And that question and answer format had a radical impact, and it has had a radical impact for the intervening centuries from Trent to now. And the aim of the Catechism of the Council of Trent was to improve the theological literacy and understanding and general scriptural education of the clergy. So the Catechism after Trent was focused on the clergy, and it was focused on ensuring that clergy were not falling into error, because obviously if the clergy were ignorant about their own tradition, the Catholic tradition and the teachings of the Catholic tradition, they wouldn't be able to instruct the faithful. So the whole emphasis on the Catechism post-Reformation was to encourage people. I describe it as almost uploading the correct software onto the mind of the hearer or the listener, and it was done in a question and answer format, like a mnemonic device to facilitate memory. It was like a memory wrap, and to facilitate people being able to recall what the correct answer was to a particular question. And we have to put this within the cultural context, because at the time of the Reformation, there were a proliferation of contested religious groups, religious leaders, all kinds of divisive teachings out there. And traditions wanted to consolidate learning and to ensure that people were not committing heresy, that they had orthodoxy, which is literally means right teaching. So the Catechism was a format that was designed to further this. So it was based on questions and answers and memorization, and it was officially sanctioned, and oral recitation became really, really important, so that you learned through recitation. And that's very important, I suppose, repeating something and saying it. And the overall aim, at a time when there was great fear of heresy and error, was to eliminate error and to replicate accurate teaching. And we can have a look at how this impacted on traditions. So it focused on doctrines, and a major focus now. We saw Augustine talking about love and story and being focused on the experience of the learner. And Augustine actually said that you had to adapt your material for your learners. So he recommended shorter catechisms for people who could concentrate for less time, and longer ones for those who are capable of greater elucidation of the teachings of the faith. In Trent and subsequent to Trent, there was a shift more on doctrine, on official teaching, and what we might call propositional content. So there tended to be an emphasis on correct language and complex language, and it might have been a bit abstract and disconnected from the story of Scripture or the story of faith. So after Trent, catechisms in the Catholic tradition were originally written in Latin, but as the centuries advanced, you got them written in a whole host of languages. And indeed, in the 17th century, we have Irish catechisms, and you can see there an example of an Irish catechism. And actually, you can see in the National Archives of Ireland examples of Anchagas Christi of Irish catechisms. So when it came to Ireland in 1660, there was a synod in Tuam, and it directed that every parish priest in Ireland should have a copy of the catechism. And so the focus originally was on the clergy. And it was a kind of one-stop go-to place to find out what the Catholic Church taught on key issues of faith and morals. And I think we have to realize that at that time, there were not many books in circulation, and that its emphasis on memorization, really enabled learners to come to terms with the complex teachings of the tradition. So it was hugely successful, catechisms. And it wasn't only in the Catholic tradition. We saw that Luther presented his short catechism. They were used in a variety of Christian traditions. And here's an example of a catechism for Methodist missions, for Methodist missionaries to use in teaching the faith. And they were normally short documents. And again, the Heidelberg Catechism is a Protestant confessional catechism in the Reformed tradition, and you can buy several of them on eBay. And recently I went into a charity shop and I got a fantastic catechism. I love collecting them. And by the way, in Limerick, in Mary Immaculate College, we have a fabulous collection of catechisms in the library that Monsignor Tynan, who used to lecture in Mary I, he used to teach religion, he built that collection up in the 1950s and in the early 60s. So we're very lucky to have that. Hence, I have an interest in catechisms. In the 18th century, catechisms moved from being the preserve of the clergy and priests and officials within the church. It moved from the seminary into the home. And here you have a lovely painting called the Presbyterian Catechism by John Philip. And you see a domestic scene. You see the woman there, the mother, breastfeeding the baby, a little toddler at her knee. And there you see the father reading the catechism. So the catechism moved from the pulpit and the seminary into the home. And it was very successful in educating the laity. Here is a Polish-English Catholic catechism, again, because the Catholic catechisms were in Latin, but obviously they became disseminated in many languages throughout the world in the 18th and 19th century, and their popularity was unrivaled as a tool for faith formation. In the late 18th and early 19th century, they were used in schools, and they were focused now on children. So we've moved from clergy to the home, and now in the 19th century, we're focusing on children. And catechisms were adapted for children so that they had shorter, simpler, easier questions to remember. And it was a fantastic tool for assessment, because if you asked a child a question and they didn't know the answer, well, you knew then immediately that they didn't understand that question. So it became a very convenient way of teaching the faith. This is a painting called The Catechism by Edith Hartree, and I love this painting because you see the little tot, a little girl with the hands behind the back. She's kind of standing up to order, and she's been asked questions by the older person who's reading from the book. And it must have been hugely comforting if you were teaching the catechism, because not alone did you have all the questions, but of course you had all the answers. And that was really, it was not a difficult task to teach the catechism, but the child is here learning and reciting and responding to the questions, and she's kind of turned away and looking out to the open window. And she's in rather a drab room, and outside you can see through the open window nature and the bright colours. And there's something wistful about the child being indoors with the catechism when the world outside is beckoning through the window. So what was happening in Ireland in the 19th century? Well, in Ireland, the catechism was the major catechetical tool used by the Catholic Church from the beginning of the national school system in 1831, really up until Vatican II in 1965. So that's an incredible thing, that the one kind of methodology or the one approach was used to teach religion, and it was incredibly successful. And there's an academic called Edward Rogan, and he says that the proliferation of the Catholic faith and the great numbers the rising numbers of Catholics in the 19th century in Ireland is in no small part attributed to the success of the catechising tool, because it gave clarity, it gave simplicity, it was cheap. The one book could be used by all the people in a household, and even if somebody wasn't particularly literate, say the grandparents or the parents weren't literate, if the child was going to school, the child could recite it for them, and through word of mouth, from catechismus, through oral language, the learning of the faith could spread. So religious literacy definitely spread in the 19th century. The green or penny catechism, it was cheap, it was known throughout Ireland, and it started with a bishop in the UK called Bishop Chandler, and it sold 15 million copies. It was one of the most widely available books in the 19th century, and it gave a summary of theology and the creation, the fall, incarnation, the sacraments, the commandments. They were all there. And it was felt that if you could recite the catechism, that it would keep you from falling into error or falling into danger. So for a little tot, a little child who's in school in the 1850s or 60s or the 1920s, there were many, many questions in the catechism. And the question and answer format established in Trent was used right up until the 1960s in Ireland. Now, for a child in primary school, they would have up to 400 questions and answers to have memorized by the time they were 11. And they spent a considerable amount of time learning off the catechism. For infants, there were 65 questions and answers before a child was 7. So, you know, that put a lot of pressure on the child. And we have to wonder about the impact of this on children with learning difficulties and children whose memories were not great. But for children who were very good at remembering and memorizing, and we must remember at the time that in all curricular areas, memorization was hugely important at that time. The catechism was, you know, children were very proud. I've heard older people saying that they used to feel really proud that they were moving through the questions in the catechism. They had a sense of achievement. The simplest question in the catechism was, who made the world? God made the world is the answer to that question. And I heard Tony Lyons, our great colleague and a fabulous historian who has written on hedge schools and the history of education. But Tony said to me at one stage, he said, you know, the question, who made the world, that has baffled and puzzled philosophers for millennia, was the simplest question to answer in the catechism. It was the first question. And maybe it was for infants, and you just learned God made the world. And maybe that's a kind of insight into the disadvantage of the catechism, that the questions were preset for the children. It didn't allow their own innate curiosity and critical idiosyncratic questioning to develop, and it gave them preset answers, so that the whole search for meaning was kind of bypassed through the catechism, and that was one of the faults of it. So the kids had to learn difficult things, and one of them is, what is venial sin? For a 5-year-old to learn this, venial sin is an offence which does not kill the soul, yet displeases God and often leads to mortal sin. So it might have been difficult for children to make sense of this. And of course, if children could recite and parrot, respond to the question, there was no indication at all whether it meant anything to them or whether or not they agreed with it. So that was another challenge for the catechism. It must have been fantastic for some teachers who loved having the book in their hands, having all the questions and all the answers. It was a dream in terms of planning. You didn't have to do much planning. So you used the same inexpensive catechism for all the classes. And you knew that question 1 to 65 was for infants, question 66 to 130 was for first and second class. And so you had this wonderful book at your disposal. So the teachers set questions to be learned. If the teacher was good, and many teachers were good, they tried to bring the questions to life, they tried to supplement them with stories, they tried to make them interesting and relevant. If the teacher was not particularly good, it was just a rote learning exercise. And there was choral response to and recitation of the catechism. And homework was set, and the kids went home and they learned it through question and answer. And the teacher had a successful lesson if all of the children could respond to the questions and answers that were set. However, what was it like for the children? Well, you know, it was greeted variously by children. Some children loved it, other children found it very difficult. And here we have from Brendan Behan's humorous, but, you know, short story called The Confirmation Suit. And we get a little insight into the catechism. And he says, for weeks it was nothing but simony and sacrilege. He's preparing for confirmation. And one of the aspects of confirmation at that time in Ireland was that when you stood up to be anointed by the oil of chrism at confirmation, you were asked a question by the bishop from the catechism, and you had to answer it publicly. So if you didn't know the answer, there would be huge trepidation and fear and, you know, a sense of being publicly shamed, perhaps, if you didn't know it. So Behan is talking about this, and he says, for weeks it was nothing but simony and sacrilege, and the sins crying to heaven for vengeance. The big green catechism, Bishop Chandler's catechism, in our hands, walking home along the North Circular Road in Dublin. And after tea, at the back of the brewery wall, with a butt, a cigarette too, to help our wits. And the questions were, what is a pure spirit? And don't kill that. Bilzer has to get a drag of the butt out of it yet. What do I mean by apostate? And hell and heaven and despair and presumption and hope. So you have a whole mixture there of the child. They're at their wits' end, dragging out of the fags, trying to remember the questions to the catechism. And it's all mixed up. So, you know, that's an insight. Catechism has been a theme in Irish literature, and Brendan Kennelly has a powerful but a very sad poem called Catechism, which he wrote as part of the collection The Boats Are Home. And this is the first verse of it. Religion class, Mulcahy, the teacher, taught us God, while he heated his arse to a winter fire, testing with his fingers the subtle sally rod, the stick he was going to beat them with if they didn't know the answers. Explain the Immaculate Conception, Maguire, and tell us about the mystical blood. Maguire failed. Mulcahy covered the boy's head with his satchel, shoved him stumbling among the desks, lashed his bare legs until they bled. So you see here that catechism class is not a positive learning experience at all. It's counterproductive, it's vicious, and it's brutal. And the bleeding legs of the child, because they don't know the correct answer, are counterpoised by the mystical blood, the loving blood of Christ, spilled for love of humanity. And you have the teaching of the catechism now as an occasion of vicious, vitriolic aggression and violence against the children. So I suppose I included that because people's understanding of the catechism can be very positive, and people may have very positive experiences. A lot of people have negative experiences as well. And I had the privilege and honour of interviewing John Coulihan, who was Professor and Emeritus Professor of Education at the University of Maynooth. And in an interview with him, we were talking about religion and education. He said to me, there was a time before Vatican II when religious instruction was the darkest subject on the school curriculum. Why? I asked him. He said there was an excess of information and a paucity of formation. So very little about the experience of the child, the natural curiosity of the child, and it was all about, you know, preset questions and answers, which again is a world away from the Gospels. It's a world away from the Didache. It's a world away from St. Augustine and from good catechetical texts. Just to say, in Limerick, where the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies is based, we have a national expert, or we had, on the Catechism, a Monsignor Michael Tynan, who gathered catechisms. He wrote a short catechism for children in the 1950s, and he has given us a legacy of a collection of catechisms in the library in Mary I, and it's just lovely to see them because they're the living testimonies of how children and adults and clergy have been educated for centuries. In writing the short catechism, he introduced in the 1950s colour plates, little coloured images, which were really innovative at the time. And he had different dots next to the questions. So red dots for the questions for the infant children, and blue dots for the children in first and second class, and black dots for the children in third and fourth class, and so on. So he tried to adapt the catechism and make them more child friendly. The catechism is not out of vogue. It is not gone. The Catechism of the Catholic Church in 1992 was a phenomenal undertaking, spearheaded by St. Pope John Paul II. And again, it's a compendium of church teaching. And if you want to know, what does the Catholic Church teach on a particular issue, on life after death, on sin, on the Eucharist, on marriage, on love, you go to the Catechism of the Catholic Church and you Google it and you go to it online and you get orthodox. What do I mean by that? Ortho meaning straight or right, doxy meaning teaching. So it's officially sanctioned teaching of the Catholic Church. And in an age when we're wondering about fake news and there are so many different sources of information at our fingertips, sometimes when it comes to religion, people don't know what to think, or they don't know what a tradition teaches. Well, this will tell you what the officially sanctioned teaching of the Catholic Church is. Of course, in theology and in religious education today, we realize that there are so many different interpretations, but that clarity and that source of knowing what the official teaching is good. And memorization, has it gone out of fashion? No, it hasn't. In Ireland, in the Grow and Love programme for primary school children, and in the 2015 preschool and primary RE curriculum for Catholic schools in Ireland, memorisation of key prayers and biblical texts, just very short mass responses or little hymns or poems, that's all part of the tradition today. So it's not that we have thrown these out completely. I just want to show you that there are all kinds of ways of teaching the catechism. Here is a musical catechism. The Baltimore Catechism states, and it's setting the catechism to music. I'll try and turn this off now. So there are all kinds of versions of catechisms. And there's an Irish catechism for adults, which was produced in 2014. There is a catechism for youth, Youth Reach catechism, and people are still asking, what is church teaching? And so it mightn't be in a format that, you know, is like a novel or like a short story, but it's there as a repository, as a compendium, as a handbook of teaching to guide people and help people. So at the end of all of this, what's the legacy of the catechism? And I always think of T.S. Eliot here and his quote, "We had the experience, but missed the meaning." And I think the challenge for catechisms is to keep in dialogue, that wonderful, rich dialogue between experience and meaning, between reason and faith, between life and doctrine. And sometimes in the past, St. Augustine was telling us, you know, hang on to the story, hang on to the love of God, let love be your focus, and have it meaningful and child-centered. The Gospels are short stories, narrative accounts, love letters sent to support us in our faith. After Trent, after the Reformation, catechisms became heavily saturated in doctrine. and doctrine tended to take over at the expense of meaning, at the expense of story. So there might have been an imbalance. I don't think it does anyone a service to rubbish all the catechisms and say they're out of vogue and they're useless. They had a clarity in the 19th century when people were illiterate, when they hadn't access to books, when they had, you know, limited educational opportunities. Catechisms were phenomenally successful in helping to educate people in faith. And catechisms moved from the clergy into the home, into the classroom. Today, catechisms are one among many methodologies and sources that we use in RE. So I am fascinated by them. I think they give us an insight on our understanding of the Christian faith. And I think that they're worthy of taking a look at. So if you see particularly the Catechism of the Council of Trent for sale on eBay for a cheap amount of money, go for it. Okay, thanks. Carly, will you turn off the recording? Thank you.